The story begins in the summer of 1851 on a sprawling cotton plantation outside Vicksburg, Mississippi, a place known to the locals simply as Red Hollow. It was a plantation that measured everything. Every pound of cotton, every nail, every fence repair, every new baby born in the quarters, every slave sold, bought, punished. Its owner, Silas Harrington, was famous, or most feared for one thing above all: he never miscounted. But on a humid August morning, before the sun had fully burned through the river fog, something appeared on that plantation that Silas never counted, never recorded, never admitted to owning: a boy. No one saw where he came from. No wagon arrived. No trader passed. No neighbor visited. Yet when Maisie, the midwife, stepped out of her cabin with a tin bucket in her hand, she froze. Because sitting at the steps of the old abandoned tool shed, knees pulled tight to his chest, was a child she had never seen before. He couldn't have been more than 12. His clothes were ragged, 2 big trousers tied with rope, a ripped shirt. His bare feet were covered in dust, and his wrists were rubbed raw, like ropes had been there for days. But the strangest thing was not his clothes, or the way he sat so still. It was his eyes. Hazel, almost golden, clear as river glass. Eyes that seemed wrong on a child's face. Eyes that looked, Maisie would say years later, like they had seen too much already. Maisie swallowed, stepped closer. "Boy, where you come from?" she whispered. The child lifted his head slowly. There was no fear in his expression, no confusion. Just a quiet, unsettling calm. He looked past Maisie toward the big house on the hill. Then he looked back at her, and, with a voice too steady for his age, he said, "I'm supposed to be here. They brought me home." Maisie's hands trembled, because she knew every man, woman, and child on Red Hollow, every birth, every death, every face. And she knew one thing for certain. This boy had never been here before. Red Hollow had a way of swallowing new things, new tools, new animals, even new people, into its rhythm so quickly that no one questioned how they'd arrived. But this boy didn't blend in. He didn't act like someone lost or frightened or running. He sat with the posture of a child who believed he had arrived exactly where he was meant to be. Word spread through the quarters like smoke through dry grass. By sunrise, half the plantation had drifted toward the tool shed, pretending to pass by on errands they didn't have. They saw the same things Maisie had seen: the rope-burned wrists, the torn shirt, the strange calm, and above all, those pale, golden eyes that seemed to be searching for something or someone up at the big house. Before long, Gaines the overseer came stomping down the path, boots thudding, jaw tight with irritation. He didn't waste breath asking questions. He grabbed the boy by the arm hard enough to make him stumble and dragged him up the hill toward the house. The boy didn't resist, not once. He didn't cry or beg or pull back. He walked like someone being taken somewhere he already expected to go. It unsettled Gaines so much that he yanked the boy harder, as if trying to break that eerie calm. Silas Harrington stepped out onto the front porch just as Gaines shoved the boy forward. Silas didn't like surprises, and he especially didn't like surprises delivered to his doorstep by slaves who couldn't explain them. He folded his arms, watching the boy with sharp, calculating eyes. "Where'd you come from?" he demanded. No greeting, no introduction, just the question, heavy as a whip. The boy lifted his chin, and for the first time, Silas got a full look at those unsettling eyes. Something flickered across his face. Confusion, or maybe recognition, but it vanished so fast, Gaines later wondered if he'd imagined it. The boy answered in a voice so steady it sounded rehearsed, "This is my father's land. My name is Daniel." A thick, uncomfortable silence settled over the porch. Silas's brow knotted, and for a moment he didn't speak. He stared at the boy with an expression that wasn't anger or suspicion, but something stranger, like he was looking at a ghost. Then his voice came low and tight. "We don't own a Daniel." Gaines gripped the boy's shoulder. "Who owned you before this? Trader? Neighbor? Where's your papers?" He jerked the boy's wrists up, turning them over for inspection. Fresh rope burns, but no branded initials, no auction marks, no scars of punishment. Nothing that told the usual story of how a child came to be property in Mississippi. Silas's frown deepened. "Strip him," Silas ordered. The boy didn't flinch as Gaines tore his shirt open to check his back. No scars, no welts, no whip lines, just smooth skin, sun-darkened but unmarred. Not a field child, not a runaway, not a trader's drop-off. But then Gaines found it, something small, hidden beneath the collar of the ragged shirt. A thin leather cord, nearly worn through, holding a tarnished silver disc. Gaines ripped it off and handed it to Silas. The plantation owner turned it over in his hand, and the moment he saw the engraving, his face went rigid. On one side was the carving of a lamb. On the other, barely readable under years of wear. D.H. 1840. Gaines leaned in. "What's it say, sir?" Silas didn't answer. He couldn't tear his eyes off the pendant, because the initials matched a name he had buried 5 years earlier, a name carved into a headstone behind the house, a name he had once whispered with tenderness before grief burned all softness out of him. Daniel Harrington, his only legitimate son. Dead at age 6. And standing barefoot on his porch was a boy who claimed the same name, a boy the same age his son would have been had he lived. A boy wearing his dead child's pendant like it had never left the family's hands. Gaines shifted nervously. "Sir, should I take him to the barn? Lock him up till we figure who he belonged to?" Silas finally lifted his gaze from the pendant to the boy, and in the burning Mississippi heat, a coldness crept into his expression, fear, anger, or something deeper no one could name. "No," Silas said slowly, voice trembling in a way that made Gaines take a step back. "Take him inside." The boy didn't look afraid as Gaines led him through the wide doorway into the main hall of the Harrington house, a place where no slave child had ever set foot without trembling. Red Hollow's big house was built like a fortress. Thick pine beams, polished floors, heavy drapes that shut out most of the daylight. Dust motes drifted lazily in the still air, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like footsteps in a church. The boy stepped across the threshold as though he'd lived there all his life, pausing only to glance at the tall grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging slowly back and forth. For a strange moment, it felt like he was matching his breathing to its slow, steady rhythm, as if grounding himself in something familiar. Silas followed them inside, the pendant still clutched in his fist so tightly the edges dug into his skin. Gaines shoved the boy toward the parlor, but Silas snapped, "Not there. Bring him to the study." The overseer blinked, confused. Silas Harrington didn't bring anyone, white or black, into his study, unless the matter was grave. But he obeyed, pushing the boy through a door into a smaller room lined with shelves full of account books, ledgers, plantation maps, and framed sketches of a child with soft curls and bright eyes. The sketches were placed carefully around the room, on shelves, above the fireplace, even on Silas's desk. The same child in every drawing, 6, maybe 7 years old, smiling in some, serious in others, a boy whose face was a ghost lingering in every corner. Daniel's eyes took in the room slowly, tracing the drawings one by one. When he reached the large sketch above the mantel, he stopped. His breath hitched ever so slightly. That sketch showed a child with those same unmistakable pale hazel eyes, the same shape of jaw, the same faint dimple in the left cheek. It was like looking into a mirror of a life he had never lived but somehow remembered. Gaines noticed and muttered, "Looks like he's seen a haint." But Silas didn't speak. He was staring at the boy with a look so raw and haunted it made the air in the room feel heavy. Silas finally stepped forward, voice sharp but unsteady. "Tell me your name." The boy lifted his chin. "Daniel." Silas swallowed hard. "Daniel what?" A heartbeat of silence passed. Then the boy said quietly, with absolute certainty, "Daniel Harrington." Gaines nearly dropped the stack of letters he was carrying. "Sir, the boy's lying. Ain't no way—" Silas raised a trembling hand to silence him, eyes locked on the child. "Who told you that name?" "No one," the boy replied. "It's mine." The plantation owner's face twisted. Anger, grief, confusion, all fighting for control. "My son died," he whispered through the clenched teeth. "He was buried behind this house, buried in good ground. I held him in my arms when he drew his last breath. I watched the earth close over him. So you—" His voice cracked suddenly, violently. "You are not him." The boy didn't cry, didn't protest. He simply looked around the study again, gaze brushing over every sketch, every ledger, every corner of the room like he was trying to confirm something inside himself. Then he met Silas's eyes and said in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone, "I remember this place. I remember the window, the trees outside, the clock in the hall that never stops ticking. I remember the fever." Gaines stumbled backward, knocking into the edge of the desk. Silas went pale, ashen, like he'd seen a corpse rise and speak, because no one outside the Harrington family had ever been allowed in that study. No slave child had ever seen the view from its windows. No one in the quarters knew the Harrington boy died of fever. The ledger listed it as illness, the polite lie that plantations used to avoid questions. But the most chilling part was this. Silas's dead son had spent the last week of his life in this very room, on a cot by the window, staring at the same trees Daniel had just described. The boy in front of him, barefoot, dirty, rope-burned, was either a liar of impossible genius or something far more dangerous. Silas's voice was barely more than a whisper when he finally spoke. "Gaines, lock him upstairs, and don't tell a soul." Because whether the boy was lying, mistaken, cursed, or something else entirely, one thing had become horrifyingly clear to Silas Harrington. This child knew things only a dead boy should have known. Gaines dragged Daniel up the narrow wooden staircase, the boards creaking under every step, but the boy didn't resist. He climbed as if he had done it 100 times before, pausing only once, halfway up, to rest his hand lightly on the banister. The gesture was strange, familiar, like muscle memory. Gaines noticed and felt a chill. He yanked Daniel's arm harder, muttering, "Don't get clever, boy." But Daniel only whispered, "It's still loose," in a tone so soft Gaines almost missed it. The overseer froze, because the spot Daniel's hand was touching was loose, one of the banister posts that had wobbled since Silas's son had played there years ago. No slave had ever been allowed up these stairs. No one in the quarters knew anything about the Harrington child's old habits. Gaines didn't know it either, but Silas did, and when he heard about it later, it would make his blood run cold. The upstairs hallway was dim, lit only by a single lantern on a small table. Dust blanketed the floor, except for a long path worn by Silas's restless pacing over the years. Every door was closed except one, the last room at the end of the hall. That was where Silas kept anything that reminded him of the son he'd lost. His late wife's prayer book, the child's worn shoes, a small wooden horse whittled from river cypress. No one else was allowed inside. Not the servants, not Gaines, not even Silas's own sister when she visited. It was a shrine, locked and untouched. But when Gaines tried to shove Daniel into a guest room, Silas's voice echoed up the stairs. "No, the last room. Put him there." Gaines stared down the hallway as though Silas had ordered him to open a coffin. "Sir, that room ain't been touched in years." Silas gripped the banister with white knuckles, voice trembling but firm. "Do what I said." So Gaines marched Daniel toward the door at the end of the hall, the door everyone avoided, the one that seemed to hold its breath. When he unlocked it, a wave of stale, cold air drifted out, the kind that clings to places frozen in memory. The room was exactly as it had been left the day Silas's child died. A small bed with quilts still creased from a restless, feverish body, a wooden toy horse lying on its side, curtains half pulled as though someone had meant to return and finish the chore. Daniel stepped inside slowly. He didn't look frightened. He didn't look surprised. He looked home. His gaze drifted around the room, lingering on the window, the bed, the chest at the foot of it. He reached out and ran his fingers across the wooden horse, brushing away a thin layer of dust. "I lost this," he murmured. "I thought it fell behind the stove." Gaines felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. "You watch your mouth," he snapped. "You don't know nothing about this place." Daniel didn't answer. He touched the windowsill, tracing a faint carved line with his fingertip. A small scratch, a mark, a scar in the wood. No one else had noticed. Silas noticed. He stepped into the room slowly, eyes fixed on Daniel. "You know what that is?" he asked hoarsely. Daniel didn't turn around. "I made it," he whispered, "when the fever hurt my hands. Mama told me not to, but I wanted to see if the knife could cut the window." Gaines almost bolted out of the house right then, because the carved mark had been made by Silas's real son during his last week alive. He had been delirious with fever and scratched at everything within reach: walls, bedposts, the windowsill. Only Silas and his wife had seen it happen. Only they knew the story. Not even the doctor had been told. Silas's face crumpled, not with grief, but with something like fear. "You're lying," he said, but it sounded like a plea, not an accusation. "You have to be lying." Daniel finally turned toward him. His pale eyes gleamed in the dim light, reflecting a kind of sorrow too old for his young face. "Why did you bury me there?" Daniel asked softly. "Under that big oak. I was scared of that tree." Silas staggered backward as if struck. Because the real Daniel Harrington, the one Silas buried, had cried every time he saw that oak. Said the branches looked like arms reaching down for him. Silas had chosen that tree anyway, thinking the boy was too young to understand or remember. But now a stranger child stood here, saying the exact words his dead son once whispered. Gaines backed toward the door. "Sir, I ain't staying in this room another second." Silas didn't even hear him. His eyes were locked on the boy as if the past had risen, wearing a different face but the same memories. Daniel stepped forward just once and said in a voice so quiet it shook the whole room, "You shouldn't have put me in the ground." The lantern flickered violently, shadows twisting across the walls like something unseen had stirred. And in that trembling golden light, for a brief, impossible moment, Silas wondered whether the boy standing before him was really a stranger at all, or something that had come back. For the first time in years, Silas Harrington locked the door to the upstairs hallway from the inside. He didn't want servants wandering near the room. He didn't want Gaines asking questions. He didn't want anyone hearing or seeing whatever that boy might do next. The big house was suddenly too quiet, like even the cicadas outside had paused their endless buzzing to listen. Downstairs, Silas poured himself whiskey with shaking hands, staring at the pendant on the table. DH 1840. Exactly as he'd ordered, engraved when his wife had given birth to their son. He had hung it around the child's neck himself. Yet the pendant he buried with his boy was still in the family graveyard, wrapped carefully in a lock of the child's hair. So how was this one here? Silas pressed his palms against his eyes, breathing hard. "It's not him," he whispered. "It's not possible." But the truth was that Red Hollow had never cared much for what was possible. Strange things had happened here before. Animals refusing to cross certain parts of the field. Slaves swearing they heard a child crying near the oak tree at night. Tools moving from place to place with no explanation. Silas had always dismissed them. Superstition, he'd said. Ignorant nonsense. But now the weight of those dismissed stories hung heavy in the air. Upstairs, Daniel sat on the small bed in the dust-choked room as if it were the most natural place in the world. He ran his hand over the faded quilt, fingers pausing at a tear near the corner. He whispered, almost to himself, "Mama tried to fix this." The room seemed to breathe around him, the old wooden boards settling, the shutters clicking softly in the breeze. Daniel tilted his head, listening to something no one else could hear. A faint tapping. Soft, irregular, almost like knuckles tapping wood. He turned toward the far wall. Tap, tap, tap. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't a rat or wind. It was coming from inside the wall. Daniel stood and walked toward the noise. Dust fell in soft clouds as he pressed his palm flat against the old boards. "I hear you," he whispered. A cold shiver ran through the room, and the lantern flame guttered. Tap, tap, tap. This time louder, as if something, or someone, was knocking from the other side. Downstairs, Silas heard it too. A dull thud. Then another. He froze, breath catching in his throat. No one else was upstairs. No servant dared go up there, and Daniel weighed barely 80 pounds. He couldn't make that sound even if he tried. Silas grabbed a lantern and crept up the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. Near the top, he paused. There was whispering, a child's whisper. High, thin, wavering. Not Daniel's voice. This one was younger, sicker, breathier. The same voice Silas had heard on the last night of his boy's life, calling out between fits of fever, "Papa, Papa, I'm cold." Silas gripped the banister, knuckles white, lantern shaking so badly its light danced wildly across the walls. When he reached the room, he found Daniel standing perfectly still, facing the wall. What are you doing?" Silas rasped. Daniel didn't turn. "He's scared," he whispered. "He's been here a long time." Silas's stomach dropped. Who's scared?" Daniel finally turned, hazel eyes glowing in the lantern light. "Your son." Silas stumbled backward, lantern nearly slipping from his hand. "No," he gasped. "No, he's gone. I buried him myself." Daniel nodded slowly. "You buried his body, not him." The wall behind Daniel groaned, boards bending outward as if something pressed against them from the inside. Silas choked on his breath, stepping back until he hit the hallway wall. Silas forced the words out through shaking lips. "What are you?" Daniel blinked, expression unreadable. "I don't know, but he knows me." The wall bulged. Once, twice. Then a long, low moan hummed through the entire house, like the sound of wind blowing through the grave. Silas shouted, "Get away from there!" But Daniel didn't move. Instead, he whispered something that froze Silas's blood cold. He remembers the dark. The room's lantern blew out. The hallway light died with it. The entire second floor plunged into suffocating blackness. And Silas finally understood. Whatever had come back wearing his son's memories wasn't alone. Something else had come with him now. When the light died, the house seemed to inhale. Every board tightened, every nail creaked, every beam groaned as if Red Hollow, an old rotting beast of timber and memory, had suddenly awakened from a long, uneasy sleep. Silas stood frozen in the hallway, the extinguished lantern shaking in his hand. A darkness like this wasn't natural. It felt thick, heavy, almost alive. His breath came out in short, frantic bursts. And in that pitch-black air, he could hear something he had not heard in years. A child, crying. Not Daniel. The sound was too faint, too broken, too fragile. It was the same soft sobbing he had heard on the night his real son died. The night the fever took the child's mind first, then his voice, then his life. Silas whispered into the dark. Daniel, hoping, pleading that it was somehow the boy in front of him. But the sobbing came from behind the wall, from inside the very boards. Up ahead, in the dead child's room, Daniel spoke in a calm voice that didn't fit the moment at all. He's cold again, he said softly. He doesn't like the place you left him. Silas's throat tightened. He had chosen that oak tree because it stood alone, far from the workers' cabins, far from the noise. He hadn't known, couldn't have known, that his son had been terrified of that tree. Another sound rose, slow, dragging, scraping, as if something unseen was sliding its hand down the inside of the wall. Silas wanted to run, but his legs refused. He couldn't leave, not while that voice, his son's voice, was crying inside these walls like a trapped breath. Gaines suddenly crashed through the front door downstairs, calling loudly, "Sir?" His boots pounded across the floor. Light went out down here all at once. Something wrong with the oil, maybe. He stopped at the foot of the stairs. Silas didn't see Gaines, but he heard him. Heard the fear rising in the overseer's voice as the sobbing drifted down the staircase. "Sir, who's up there with you?" Gaines whispered. Silas couldn't answer. The words were lodged in his throat. Gaines took one step up the stairs, only one, before the hallway temperature dropped. Sharp cold, like winter night air seeping out of a tomb. His breath fogged in front of him. Then came the whisper, not from the boy in the room, not from Silas, from the walls themselves. "Papa." Silas slammed a hand against his mouth, choking back a cry. Gaines scrambled back down the steps as if the devil had reached for his ankles. Daniel remained perfectly still, facing that swelling wall where the boards bulged outward, the wood bending under invisible pressure. The boy raised a hand, pressing his palm against it. "It hurts," he whispered. "He doesn't like being alone." The boards throbbed like a heartbeat. Silas couldn't breathe. "Stop. Stop touching it." His voice cracked. "Please." Daniel didn't move his hand. Instead, he turned his head just slightly toward Silas. "You shouldn't have left him in the ground," he said gently. The fever took him, but his fear stayed. The crying grew louder, now mixing with soft scratching, as if fingernails dragged along the inside of the wood. A cold wind swept the room, whipping dust into spirals. The half-open drawers of the dead child's dresser slid shut with slow, deliberate thumps. One by one, by one. Silas squeezed his eyes shut. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. "The truth," Daniel replied. The word felt like a blade. Silas shook his head violently. No, I buried him. I buried my boy. I did what a father is supposed to do." Daniel looked at him sadly. But you didn't bury the right one. Silas felt the world tilt. What? What are you saying? His voice was faint, barely a breath. The wall behind Daniel gave one violent shudder. Dust rained down. The house moaned like something inside was pushing to get out. Daniel stepped aside. Listen, he said. Silas strained to hear over the crying and scratching and the thumping of his own terrified heart. Then he heard it. A second voice, not crying, not calling for Papa. A small, gasping voice on the edge of panic. Let me out. Silas collapsed against the hallway wall. The lantern slipped from his hands, rolling across the floor. Because that voice, the one begging, desperate, trapped, was not his son's. And whatever was knocking inside those walls was something else entirely. Silas sank to the floor, choking on his own breath as the house groaned around him. Two voices, one sobbing, one begging, echoed through the upstairs hallway, weaving together like a twisted hymn no living ear was meant to hear. Daniel stood calmly between Silas and the trembling wall, the faint lantern glow barely outlining his small frame. His eyes were strange, soft, sympathetic, and yet so hollow they looked almost ancient. He didn't want the dark, Daniel whispered. He was afraid of it. That's why he called for you, but you never came. Silas flinched as though struck. The memories came back in disjointed flashes. His wife dying in childbirth. The baby feverish before he could even walk. Doctors shaking their heads, the small body trembling in a blanket. And Silas, angry, grieving, burying himself in work because it hurt too much to sit at his dying child's side for more than a moment. I tried, he rasped. God knows I tried. But Daniel shook his head slowly. You tried when it was too late. When he was gone. The boards behind Daniel expanded violently, pushing outward so far they bowed like a drum skin about to burst. Thick cracks crawled along the wood. Then, through those cracks, something slid through. A tiny hand, pale and wrinkled, fingers curling outward like a newborn reaching blindly for its father. Silas screamed, scrambling backward on his hands and knees until he hit the banister. Gaines bolted halfway up the stairs, saw the hand pushing through the shattered wood, and turned white as river clay. Dear Lord, he whispered, but Daniel stepped forward, placing his own small hand against the ghostly fingers. You weren't alone, he murmured softly, as if soothing a terrified child. I'm here now. The little hand froze. The scratching stopped. The crying thinned to a trembling breath, and the voice, weak, broken, whispered, Cold. Silas felt something inside him snap. Guilt. Not the quiet, manageable kind he had carried for years, but raw, suffocating guilt flooded him. I didn't know, he shouted into the room, voice cracking apart. I didn't know you were afraid. I didn't... His words dissolved into sobs as he pressed his forehead to the floor. Daniel looked back at him with something like pity. He wasn't calling for help, the boy said gently. He was calling because he was lost between this world and the next. The pale hand withdrew back into the darkness of the wall. The wood settled. The house went still again, as though it had finally exhaled. Silence blanketed the room. Daniel stepped toward Silas, kneeling beside him. That wasn't your son, he said softly. Not all of him. The fever took him, but something else stayed behind. Something that didn't know how to leave. Silas raised his head slowly, eyes red and haunted. Then what are you? His voice barely carried. Daniel didn't look away. The part that left, he whispered. The part that remembered you. The part that wanted to come home. A shudder ran through Silas's entire body. Grief, awe, terror. He didn't know which one to surrender to. But when he met Daniel's golden eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected. Not accusation, not anger, not blame. Forgiveness. Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out toward the oak tree where Silas had buried his child. The dawn light was beginning to bleed into the sky. "He's not trapped anymore," Daniel said. "He needed someone to see him, to hear him. Now he can rest." Silas rose shakily to his feet, reaching out as if to touch Daniel's shoulder, but stopping inches short. "Will you stay?" he asked. It came out like a plea. Daniel turned. His face was calm, serene, too wise for a 12-year-old. "I was never meant to stay," he said. "I only came to finish what he couldn't." Silas blinked, and Daniel was suddenly fading. Not disappearing all at once, but thinning, like morning fog dissolving in sunlight. His outline blurred. His voice grew softer. His skin dimmed from warm brown to mist gray, and his golden eyes flickered like two candles guttering in a draught. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, "for finally listening." And then he was gone. No pop, no scream, no burst of light. Just an empty room, a broken wall, and a grieving father kneeling alone in the quiet that followed. For years afterward, the slaves at Red Hollow whispered that the Harrington house changed that day, that its walls no longer groaned at night, that the upstairs hallway grew warmer, that the old oak tree stopped creaking as though burdened by invisible weight. They said Silas Harrington became softer, kinder, a man who worked the fields himself, sometimes just to be near the people he had once ruled like property. And late at night, when he stood by the upstairs window looking toward the graveyard, some swore they saw him raise his hand, as if waving to someone only he could see. But no one ever saw Daniel again. Not in the quarters, not in the fields, not in the town. He had come to finish a story that death had left incomplete. And once the truth was finally heard, he went home. For 3 days after Daniel vanished, Silas walked through Red Hollow like a man wandering through the ruins of his own life. He didn't speak to Gaines. He didn't speak to the house servants. He barely slept. And when he did, he jolted awake to the echo of two voices, one sobbing, one begging, still imprinted on the walls of his memory. Word spread through the plantation that something had happened in the big house, something the master wouldn't discuss, something that changed the air itself. The workers whispered that the house felt lighter, as if a long-buried sorrow had finally loosened its grip. But none of them dared ask Silas what he'd seen. On the 4th morning, he woke with a strange heaviness in his chest, not dread, but purpose. He stepped outside before sunrise, boots sinking into the damp ground as the fog curled low across the yard. The great oak tree loomed at the edge of the family graveyard, its branches stretched wide like arms frozen mid-embrace. Silas had always avoided it. He once blamed that avoidance on grief. Now he knew better. He had been afraid of what he'd buried there, not the child's body, but his own guilt, his failures, the fear that maybe he had never truly known his son. He brought a shovel. The air grew colder the closer he walked to the grave. The morning birdsong died away. Even the wind held its breath. Silas stopped at the small mound where the headstone stood crooked in the soil. Daniel Harrington, 1840-1847. His hands trembled as he touched the rough stone. For years he had refused to let any worker fix the marker, too afraid someone else touching it might reopen wounds he didn't want to face. But the wounds were open now, bleeding in places he'd hidden from himself. He shoved the shovel into the dirt. The first few strikes were slow and clumsy. By the 6th blow his breath was ragged. By the 10th, tears blurred his vision. He dug deeper and deeper, the soil loosening around him. With each shovelful, memories surfaced. His son's laugh, his wife's smile, The fevered nights when he stood in the doorway too afraid to enter the room. "Forgive me," he whispered with each scoop. "Forgive me for not being the father you needed." 2 feet down, the soil grew firmer. 3 feet down, the cold intensified. At 4 feet, the shovel struck something soft. Fabric. Silas stopped breathing. Kneeling, he brushed the dirt away with trembling fingers. A child's blanket. The one his wife had sewn. Beneath it, the small wooden box they used as a coffin. He pressed his forehead to the box, shaking uncontrollably. "I'm here," he choked. "I should have come sooner. I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry." But then, he froze. The lid of the coffin had a long crack running down its center, jagged like a claw mark. Silas's heart hammered painfully as he lifted the lid. Inside lay only bones, and a small indentation in the wood, as if tiny fingers had pressed from the inside. He recoiled, hand clamping over his mouth to smother a cry. The fever that killed the boy had made him delirious, confused, but not dead immediately. The doctor had ordered the burial too quickly. Silas had trusted him, blinded by panic and grief. His son hadn't died in the bed. He had died in the ground. The breath left Silas in a strangled sob. He collapsed to his knees, shaking violently. "Daniel," he wept. "My boy, my poor boy." The wind stirred suddenly, swirling around him like a cold embrace. And in that wind, faint as memory, he heard a whisper, "Papa, you came." Silas looked up, tears streaming down his face. "I'm here," he whispered to the air. "I'm here now." The wind softened, warm for an instant, peaceful. Then it was gone. Silas carefully gathered the small bones, cradling them in his arms. He carried them up the hill to the family mausoleum, a place meant for honor, not hurried sorrow. For the first time, Daniel was laid to rest properly, not in fear, not in darkness, but with the dignity he deserved. When Silas sealed the stone door, the oak tree behind him creaked softly, not in warning, but in relief. The birds began singing again. Light broke through the clouds. The plantation felt different, as though its very soil acknowledged that something long wronged had finally been made right. Silas turned toward the house, exhausted but somehow lighter. "Rest now," he whispered. Behind him, a child's laugh, soft, bright, fleeting, echoed through the morning air. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. He knew the boy was finally free. Dot after Silas laid the bones in the mausoleum. He remained there long after the sun rose, sitting on the cold stone steps, staring at nothing. For 7 years he had carried the weight of that grave alone. Now that the truth was uncovered, the weight changed, not lighter, but clearer. He finally understood the shape of his failure. And with that understanding came a different kind of pain, one that could finally heal instead of rot. As Silas stood to leave, he noticed something on the stone floor near the entrance. A small object, half buried in dust. He bent down, picked it up, and froze. It was the pendant. The original pendant. The one he'd buried with his son. The chain was broken, the engraving still faintly visible. D.H. 1840. Silas stared at it, his heart pounding. If Daniel, the spirit of Daniel, had been trapped, how had this pendant made its way here? Unless Daniel had left it for him. A goodbye, a thank you, a release. Silas held it tightly, pressing it to his chest, and a warmth spread through him, so faint, so gentle, but unmistakably his son's presence. Just for a moment. Then it faded like morning frost. When Silas walked back down toward the house, the servants watched from afar. The overseer Gaines stood silently at the porch, hat in hand, his face pale. "Sir," he said carefully, "what happened in that room wasn't natural. The men are scared." Silas looked up at the house. The windows now still, the boards no longer groaning, the shadows no longer thick and restless. "There's nothing to fear anymore," he said quietly. "He's gone where he should have gone long ago." Gaines swallowed, unsure whether to question him. He didn't. Something in Silas's voice sounded final. At the doorway, Silas paused and looked back at the oak tree. For the first time in 7 years, it didn't feel like it was watching him. It looked like an ordinary tree, old, tall, peaceful. Something was truly gone. Something finally freed. But the house wasn't entirely empty. That night, after everyone went to sleep, Silas sat in his study staring at the pendant. The lamp flickered once, not from cold, but as if someone had passed by. Silas closed his eyes. "Good night," he whispered. Far down the hallway, a door, Daniel's old room, clicked shut by itself. Not angrily, not violently. Softly, as though someone small, someone gentle, had closed it on their way out. Silas didn't open it again. He didn't need to. He knew the child who had haunted that room, the child who had wandered the walls in fear and confusion, was finally gone. Not trapped, not lost. Free. Free in a way he had never been in life. And Silas Harrington, for the first time since burying his son, slept without nightmares.